The rule was simple, and Vivienne Ashworth had never broken it in 22 years of running her company. She did not give people money to see what they would do with it. She gave them responsibility. But the summer her father died and left her everything, the portfolio, the properties, the endowment trust with its 9-figure balance, something shifted in her. He had been a man who believed, truly believed, that character was the only currency that mattered. He used to say it at dinner when she was 11, when she was 17, when she was 34 and still rolling her eyes slightly. You can tell everything about a person by what they reach for when no one is watching. She thought about that for a long time after the funeral. She thought about it during the reading of the will, when her lawyer handed her a sealed letter her father had written 6 months before he passed. In it, he described a test he had always meant to run but never did. He called it an act of faith. Vivienne was 51 years old. She had built Ashworth Capital from a single rented office in downtown Ottawa into something that employed 400 people. She was not sentimental. She was not soft. But she read that letter 3 times, and on the 3rd reading, she picked up the phone. She chose 4 people from within her orbit. Not employees exactly, but individuals she had come to know through the company's charitable foundation over the past 2 years. People whose circumstances she understood in broad strokes but not in detail. People whose character she suspected but could not yet confirm. The first was a man named Gerald, a former city planner from Hamilton, who now ran a small urban garden cooperative in the North End. He was 44, recently divorced, with opinions about municipal zoning that he shared freely and at length. The second was a woman named Tanya, 38, who managed a boutique PR firm in Gatineau and had attended 3 of the foundation's annual galas. She dressed well and spoke well and always knew which room to be in. The third was a man named Roland, 49, an architect who had won 2 national awards for affordable housing design and then spent the last 18 months consulting for developers who built anything but. And the fourth, the one Vivienne had almost hesitated to include, because she already suspected she knew something about him that the others didn't know about themselves, was a man named Patrick Osi-Mensah. Patrick was 41. He worked as a respiratory therapist at the Ottawa hospital. He had a daughter named Grace, who was 9 years old, and a son named Marcus, who was 6. He had been raising them alone since his wife Diane died of an aortic aneurysm 3 years ago on a Tuesday morning while Patrick was finishing a night shift. He had come home to find the children standing in the kitchen in their pajamas, confused, next to a phone that had already been called twice by a neighbor. Vivienne knew this because Patrick had spoken about Diane once briefly at a foundation volunteer breakfast. He had not performed his grief. He had simply mentioned her, the way you mention someone who is still, in some essential way, present. She had not forgotten it. She met all 4 of them separately, in a boardroom on the 14th floor of her Spark Street office, over the course of a single Tuesday in October. She told each of them the same thing. She said her father had believed in people. He had spent his life measuring not what people had, but what they did with it. In his memory, she was establishing a small, private initiative. Each of them would receive access to a dedicated account. No ceiling, no restrictions, no reporting requirement. They could spend what they wanted, however they wanted, over the next 30 days. At the end of the 30 days, she would review how the funds had been used. There would be no punishment for any choice. There was no wrong answer. She did not tell them there was a right one. Gerald laughed when she said it, and then stopped laughing when he realized she wasn't joking. He asked if there was a cap. She said no. He sat back in his chair and said, "Well then." Tanya asked 2 clarifying questions, both practical, both sensible, and then thanked Vivienne with the kind of warmth that had probably served her well in every professional room she'd ever entered. Roland nodded slowly, the way people nod when they're already spending the money in their heads. He asked if receipts were required. She said no. He asked if there was any industry restriction. She said no. He said he appreciated the opportunity. Patrick was quiet for a moment after she finished explaining. Then he asked, "Why me?" It was the only question any of them had asked that she hadn't anticipated. She told him what she told the others, that she had come to know him through the foundation's work, that she valued the perspective of people doing frontline healthcare. He nodded, but she had the sense he wasn't entirely satisfied with the answer. He wasn't suspicious. He just wanted to understand the shape of the thing. That too, she noted. Gerald moved quickly. Within the first week, he had flown business class to Vancouver for a conference that he described on social media as essential networking. Though the conference was real enough, and his field was real enough, and the photos he posted showed a man having the particular kind of good time that comes with not having to think about the bill. He stayed at the Fairmont. He ate somewhere that required a reservation made 3 weeks in advance. He bought a jacket. Vivienne didn't begrudge him the jacket. By the end of week 2, Gerald had spent close to $18,000. The cooperative back in Hamilton continued to function without him, run by the 2 volunteers who had always done most of the actual work. Tanya was subtler about it, which Vivienne might have expected. She upgraded her firm's office furniture. She took 3 clients to dinner at a restaurant in the Byward Market that Vivienne herself had eaten at only twice. She booked a weekend at an inn in Prince Edward County. Solo, she said, for rest and creative restoration. She posted a single photograph of a glass of wine on a wooden table with autumn light coming through a window, and it received 211 likes. She also made one donation, $500 to a women's shelter in Gatineau. Vivienne noticed the donation. She noticed its size. Roland spent 14 days doing apparently nothing, which made Vivienne think he was either more disciplined than the others or planning something larger. It turned out to be the latter. In week 3, he transferred $42,000 into a numbered holding account that his assistant, when Vivienne's team made careful, legal inquiries, confirmed was connected to a land acquisition project. Roland had been pursuing informally for over a year. The project was not illegal. It was simply for Roland. Vivienne set down the report and looked out the window at the Ottawa River for a long time. Patrick's file came last, and it came in pieces. The first transaction was on day 4, $438 at a pharmacy on Carling Avenue. Vivienne's team cross-referenced it with publicly available information and found nothing remarkable. It was a pharmacy near the hospital where he worked. She assumed it was personal. She would come to understand it differently later. Day 6, $1,200 to an organization called Home First Ottawa, which provided transitional housing support for families leaving shelter. Patrick had apparently walked in, asked to speak to someone in intake, and made the donation in person. The intake coordinator, when asked about the visit, said he had been quiet and direct. He had not left his name initially. They had it only because he'd written it on the form when they explained they needed it for their records. Day 9, $600 to a woman named Lorraine. A colleague at the hospital, Vivienne's team eventually confirmed, whose car had broken down and who had 2 kids in school across the city. Patrick had e-transferred her the money with a note that said, "For the car. Don't argue with me about it." Day 11, Patrick went to a furniture store in Nepean. He spent $820. Vivienne's first thought was that this was the moment, the jacket, the couch, the thing he bought for himself. She almost felt relieved. She had not wanted to feel too certain too soon. But the furniture was delivered, she learned, to an address on Merivale Road that was not Patrick's apartment. It was the apartment of an elderly man named Walter, a patient Patrick had treated during a long hospitalization the previous winter, a widower with no family in the province, who had been sleeping on a mattress on the floor of a subsidized unit since he was discharged. A mattress on the floor. Vivienne read that line in the report twice. Day 14, Patrick used $250 of the account to buy art supplies. Not for himself. For Grace, his daughter, who had told him 3 weeks earlier that she wanted to try painting. He had mentioned it to a colleague, who had mentioned it to someone, and eventually the information had reached Vivienne's team through the ordinary channels of paying attention. He bought her good brushes, not the cheap ones. He bought her real paint. Day 7, $720 went to a small Haitian restaurant on Montreal Road that had been struggling since a water main break the previous spring had closed the street for 6 weeks during their busiest season. Patrick had eaten there regularly before the flood and had not stopped. He bought a catering order for a hospital staff appreciation lunch that he organized himself and paid for out of the account. 31 people ate jerk chicken and grilled and fried plantains in the hospital staff lounge on a Wednesday afternoon, and the restaurant owner, a woman named Claudette, later said it was the first catering order she had received in 4 months. Day 22. Patrick spent $60 on a children's book about birds for his son Marcus, who had become obsessed with identifying the ones that came to the feeder Patrick had attached to their apartment balcony railing with zip ties in September. Vivienne sat with that one for a moment, a $60 book about birds. She thought about the jacket Gerald bought. She thought about the wineglass photograph, the inn in Prince Edward County, the land acquisition project in Roland's name. She thought about a man attaching a bird feeder to his balcony railing with zip ties. By day 28, Patrick had spent a total of $11,415. The others had spent between $18,000 and $42,000. He had not asked anyone what the expected amount was. He had not spent strategically or conservatively out of fear. He had simply, as far as Vivienne could tell, used the money for the things that occurred to him to use it for. She called her assistant and asked for Patrick's hospital schedule. She did not want to do this formally. She did not want a boardroom and a prepared statement, and the overhead lighting that made everyone look like they were about to be evaluated. She wanted to talk to him the way people talked when they weren't performing. She found out he finished a shift at 6:30 on a Thursday morning, which meant he would be in the hospital parking garage around 6:45, tired in the specific way that night shift workers are tired. Not sleepy exactly, but hollowed out, running on the particular frequency of people who have spent the night keeping other people's lungs working. She was waiting by his car. He recognized her. He stopped walking. He said, "Ms. Ashworth." She said, "Vivienne, please." He adjusted the strap of his bag and waited. She told him she had been reviewing how the 4 participants had used the funds. She told him she wasn't there to evaluate or reward or deliver any kind of verdict. She said she wanted to ask him something. He said, "Okay." She asked him, when he spent the money the way he did, the housing organization, the colleague's car, the old man's mattress, the restaurant, the art supplies, book about birds, did he think about the fact that it wasn't his money? Did he feel the difference? Patrick looked at her for a moment. The parking garage was quiet. Somewhere in the level above them, a car started. He said, "Every time she waited." He said, "Every single time I used it, I knew it wasn't mine. And I think that's why I kept asking myself, if this isn't mine, then what is it for?" And the answer was pretty much always the same. She asked him what the answer was. He looked at the ground for a second, then back at her. He said, "It's for the thing in front of you. The thing that needs doing right now that you could actually do if money wasn't the reason you couldn't." Vivienne had prepared for this conversation. She had run it through her mind a dozen times on the drive over, and in none of those versions had she expected to feel the thing she felt then, which was, simply, that her father had been right. Character was the only currency that mattered. She had needed 30 days and 4 people in a parking garage at 6:45 in the morning to be sure of it. She made him an offer 2 weeks later. Not a job in the conventional sense. She was not interested in taking a respiratory therapist out of a hospital where he was clearly needed. What she proposed was a seat on the Foundation's advisory board, focused on healthcare access and community health equity. There was a stipend. There was flexibility. There was, she told him plainly, the expectation that he would tell her when the Foundation was getting it wrong, and she would listen. He said he needed to think about it. She told him to take his time. He called back in 3 days. He said yes, with one condition, that the board's community health initiative would prioritize families caring for elderly relatives without institutional support. He mentioned Walter. He didn't say it as leverage. He said it as information. She said yes. She called the other 3 as well, because her father would have wanted her to be honest with them. She told them she had reached a decision about the direction of the initiative and that their participation would not be continuing. She was measured and she was kind, and she said nothing that wasn't true. Gerald asked if there was feedback she could share. She thought about the jacket. She said, "I think you should trust your instincts more." She wasn't sure he understood what she meant. Tanya thanked her graciously and asked if the Foundation might consider a partnership with her firm on future communications work. Vivienne said they would keep it in mind. Roland said very little. He seemed, more than anything, unsurprised. That October, at the Foundation's annual recognition breakfast, the same event where Patrick had once mentioned Diane, the same room with the same weak coffee and the same view of the Rideau Canal going gray-green toward autumn, Vivienne stood up to speak. She talked about her father briefly. She talked about what he had believed. She talked about the idea that you could spend your whole life building things and still not know, at the end of it, what you had actually been building toward. Then she said that she had learned something over the past 30 days that she hadn't expected to learn. She said, "I thought I was measuring what people do with resources. What I was actually measuring was what people pay attention to. Those are not the same thing." Patrick was in the 3rd row. He was wearing a dark blue sweater, and he was holding his coffee with both hands, and he was listening the way he probably listened to everything, carefully, without trying to be seen listening. Beside him were 2 empty chairs where his children would have sat if the breakfast had started an hour later. He had told Vivienne they were at school. He had told her Grace had finished her first small painting, a cardinal red against a pale gray background, and taped it to the fridge. She had asked if Grace would call it anything. Patrick had smiled, and it was the kind of smile that takes a long time to come back after you've lost someone. He said Grace called it Dad's bird because she painted the one he always pointed out on the balcony. Vivienne had thanked him for telling her. She thanked him again now, quietly inside herself as she finished speaking and sat back down. Outside, the canal was still. The leaves were coming down from the trees along Colonelby Drive in slow, unhurried handfuls. The way things fall when there is no wind and no particular reason to hurry. The way things settle when they have finally found the place they were always meant to be.